There is a particular kind of violence that leaves no visible wound. It does not require a sword or a decree or even a deliberate act of malice. It requires only silence, sustained, institutionalized, generational silence, and the willingness of those who write the textbooks to decide, with the quiet authority of the pen, what deserves to be remembered and what does not. Entire civilizations have been unmade this way, not through conquest alone, but through the far more durable conquest of narrative. And nowhere has this erasure been more thorough, more consequential, or more deliberately maintained than in what Western historical tradition did to the great empires of sub-Saharan Africa. Empires that, at the height of their power, dwarfed the kingdoms of contemporary Europe in wealth, sophistication, governance, and reach. The empire that sat at the center of this erasure was not a minor footnote, not a regional chieftaincy of modest ambition. At its apex in the 14th century, the Mali Empire controlled territory stretching across nearly 2 million square kilometers of West Africa, from the Atlantic coastline deep into the Saharan interior, encompassing the upper Niger River basin, the Senegal River Valley, and the gold-laden savanna corridors that connected the continent's richest mineral deposits to its most active trade routes. It commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands, administered a complex bureaucracy of provinces and tributary states, maintained diplomatic relationships with the sultans of Morocco and the merchants of Egypt, and presided over cities whose populations and intellectual output would have been remarkable by any standard in the medieval world. By any serious metric of what constitutes an empire, Mali belongs among the great political entities of the medieval period. And yet for the better part of 4 centuries, it received barely a sentence in the canonical historical narratives produced by European scholarship.
To understand how this happened, it is necessary to understand both the empire itself and the machinery of its erasure, and to recognize that neither story is simple. The Mali Empire did not emerge from a vacuum. It grew from the ruins of an earlier order, the Ghana Empire, which had itself dominated the Western Saharan trade networks for centuries before internal pressures and external raids broke its cohesion in the 11th and 12th centuries. What rose in its place was something more ambitious, more institutionally sophisticated, and more durable. The Mande-speaking peoples of the Upper Niger, led by the Keita dynasty, constructed a political framework that understood with extraordinary clarity the fundamental truth of power in the pre-modern world. Whoever controls the movement of goods controls everything else. The wealth of Mali was rooted in 2 commodities that the medieval world could not function without: gold and salt. The Bambouk and Boré goldfields, lying within or near Mali's territorial reach, produced quantities of gold that astonished every outside observer who encountered them. Salt, extracted from the great deposits at Tagaza, deep in the Sahara, was a commodity as precious in the African interior as gold itself, essential for food preservation, livestock health, and basic human survival in a tropical climate. Mali sat astride the axis connecting these 2 resources, and the Mansas, the emperors, understood that taxing and regulating this exchange was not merely a source of revenue, but the structural basis of imperial authority itself. Every caravan that moved through Mali's territory paid duty. Every merchant who traded within its markets operated under Mali's legal framework.
The empire did not simply extract wealth. It organized and guaranteed the conditions under which wealth could be produced and exchanged, which is a far more sophisticated form of economic power and a far more stable one. The cities that flourished under this system were not primitive settlements. Timbuktu, Djenné, Niani, and Kumbi Saleh were centers of commerce, learning, and administration that attracted scholars, merchants, and diplomats from across the Islamic world and beyond. Timbuktu in particular developed into one of the most significant intellectual centers of the medieval period.
housing institutions of Islamic learning that drew students from as far as Andalusia, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula. At its peak, the city may have housed as many as 100,000 residents, making it one of the largest urban concentrations in the world at the time. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on subjects ranging from theology and jurisprudence to mathematics, astronomy, history, and medicine. These were not copies of texts produced elsewhere. They were original works, composed by African scholars, contributing to the living intellectual tradition of the medieval world. The manuscripts existed. The scholars existed. The institutions existed. They were simply not acknowledged in the historical frameworks that would later claim to describe humanity's intellectual progress. The moment at which Mali's existence became undeniable came in 1324 and 1325, during the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa to Mecca. What Mansa Musa did on that journey was not merely fulfill a religious obligation. He performed, with breathtaking theatricality and genuine substance, the most spectacular demonstration of imperial wealth that the medieval world had ever witnessed. His entourage was estimated at tens of thousands of people, courtiers, soldiers, servants, heralds, accompanied by a reported 60,000 porters and a caravan of camels bearing hundreds of pounds of gold dust and gold artifacts. As he traveled through Cairo, he distributed gold with a liberality so extreme that he single-handedly destabilized the Egyptian economy, flooding the market with gold so thoroughly that its value collapsed in the region for more than a decade afterward. The contemporary accounts of Arab historians, Egyptian bureaucrats, and Malian court chroniclers all converge on the basic facts. This was a ruler of immense wealth and sophistication, commanding an empire whose resources dwarfed those of any contemporary European monarch. Mansa Musa appeared on European maps of Africa shortly after his pilgrimage. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most important cartographic documents of the medieval period, depicts him seated on a throne in the center of Africa, holding a golden scepter and a golden orb, labeled as the richest and most noble king in all the land. He was not invisible. He was not unknown. He was simply inconvenient. The inconvenience became acute as European expansion into Africa intensified in the 15th and 16th centuries, and the justifications required for that expansion demanded a particular kind of history. Colonialism was not merely a military and economic project. It was a narrative project. It required the construction of a story in which African societies were inherently primitive, stateless, prehistorical, peoples without political organization, without intellectual tradition, without economic sophistication, who therefore stood outside the current of what European thinkers were beginning to call civilization. This story was not incidental to colonialism. It was foundational to it. It provided the moral architecture that distinguished conquest from crime, extraction from trade, enslavement from mere labor arrangement. And so the great empires of West Africa, Mali, Songhai, Ghana, Kanem-Bornu, were progressively written out of the historical canon, not because the evidence for their existence was absent, but because their existence was incompatible with the story that power needed. The mechanisms of this erasure operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the level of primary scholarship, European historians and anthropologists working in the 19th and early 20th centuries applied interpretive frameworks that systematically discounted African historical sources. Arab accounts were treated as unreliable, exaggerated, or referring to regions that could not possibly have been as described. Oral traditions, the primary vehicle through which many West African societies preserved their historical memory, were dismissed as myth
rather than recognized as structured historical testimony, despite the extraordinary rigor and internal consistency.
What remained was the silence. And silence, in the long run, is never truly neutral. Silence in history functions as a kind of slow legislation, continuously renewing a verdict about what matters and what does not, who acted and who was acted upon, whose past is considered heritage and whose is considered archaeology. Generations of African descendants, scattered by the slave trade across the Americas and the Caribbean, grew up in a world that told them their ancestors had contributed nothing to human civilization, that they came from nowhere, from peoples without history, without achievement, without the dignity of a recorded past. This was not merely an academic error. It was a wound inflicted with surgical precision through the instruments of education. And yet the elephant, as the saying goes, never forgets.
What colonial scholarship attempted to extinguish survived in ways that were more resilient than printed pages, in the oral traditions maintained by griots across the Sahel, in the architectural remains of Djenné's great mosque, in the physical manuscripts that Timbuktu's families concealed and preserved across centuries of conquest and neglect, wrapping them in cloth, burying them in sand, passing them from generation to generation, with the understanding that they represented something irreplaceable. The empire had been erased from the books that other people wrote. It had not erased itself. The Mali Empire cannot be returned to the pages it was removed from without disrupting the story that replaced it. And that is precisely why its remembrance matters, not as an exercise in celebration or in grievance, but as an act of insisting on the complexity of the past against the simplifications that power has always preferred. The elephant that was erased from the books did not disappear. It endured in memory, in stone, in manuscript, in the genealogical recitations of those who never agreed that forgetting was the same thing as never having existed. It waited, with the patience that only the genuinely great can afford, for the world to become capable of hearing what it had always been saying.